My name is Nisha Jacob. I'm a public health physician at UCT and a parishioner at St. Michael's, and it is my great pleasure to moderate today's session. And we're really looking forward to some fantastic engagement, and it's wonderful to see so many of you come, despite the chilly weather, to join us and to engage and participate. So before we get things started, I'll give you an overview of how things will work, but I'd like to welcome our parish priest, Father Chiedza, to do a short welcome.
Good evening and welcome to St. Michael's. I had to take off my jersey so that you see that I'm not wearing an ANC t-shirt. This is my high school t-shirt, St. Ignatius College. You're most welcome, and we're gathering because we love our country. We're gathering this evening because we also want to commend to God what will be happening in the next few days. So my word of welcome is to say courage. My word of welcome is to say also, let's invite the Holy Spirit to come and take control and enlighten us as we make our decisions. Most welcome.
Thank you very much, Father. So we all know the elections are fast approaching, and we find ourselves at a crossroads. Just yesterday, the president found his pen and signed the NHI bill into law, which the country responded to with mixed feelings. And so there's a lot of things that we're all thinking about as to where do we go next as a country. And really today's session is to understand where we're headed, and most importantly, the role that we can play and the role that we should play. And just by being here and engaging, it really shows that we are being active citizens and wanting to participate, wanting to inform ourselves and make informed decisions. So the format of the session, we have two really insightful speakers, really looking forward to hearing from them. Each speaker will speak for approximately 20 minutes, and after each speaker, we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. Could I request that you keep your questions brief, and we'll take about 3 questions at a time, and then the speakers will respond. So we do want to try and adhere to time, so it'll be 30 minutes for each speaker, essentially, that being 20 minutes talk and 10 minutes questions. And of course, I'm sure you'll be able to chat a little bit afterwards if there are any burning issues that you'd like to chat about further. There is a registration form that's circulating, and really that is if you would like to get the slides from today's talk and any information on future events, then please do fill out your details. It's circulating in the audience now. And other than that, really, please enjoy the session, please participate, and have fun. So I'll introduce each of the speakers just before they speak, and our first speaker is Dr. Lauren Paremoer, who will be talking where to South Africa and give us a political and social overview of the possible options. Lauren has a PhD in political sciences from New School for Social Research and an MA and undergraduate degree in politics and economics from the University of Cape Town. She's a senior lecturer in the political sciences department at UCT. Welcome, Lauren, and thank you for being here today.
So I was saying thank you to Father for the invitation and to Nisha for the introduction. When I left home and came here, I had my husband and my friend were at home, and I said, I'm going to speak to the folks at St. Michael's about the elections. What's your headline? What should I tell them? And one said, tell them nothing will change, even if they vote. And this is someone who follows, the Zuma Concord case, watched the YouTube feed from beginning to end, is reading the news constantly. So not disengaged in politics. The other person said, tell them not to vote for So I mention that because I think it reflects a kind of truth about politics in South Africa, which is, if 1994 was a story of coming together and having hope and trusting that we would all act in a way that was for the common good, I think maybe now we're in a moment where there's a little bit more mistrust, trepidation, fear. And so I think that's unfortunate. But I do think if we vote, something can change, which is why I'm here and which is why I'm happy that you're here. I expect there are many other nicer things you could be doing. But I think it's important to show up. And in a sense, maybe nothing will change simply by voting, but I think also by showing up to collective forums, discussions, events like these. That's how we make a difference also between elections. So that's the start. The first part is maybe a little bit boring. It's kind of procedural stuff, but I think it's important. Tomorrow, for all of those of you who will not be in your voting district, maybe you're visiting someone on election day, tomorrow is the last day you can register to vote outside of your voting district. So I put that up because I think it's important. Then we know that there are special votes that are cast on the 27th and 28th, so these include home visits. And then the 29th, of course, is election day. I think polls open at 7 a.m. So I'm not sure how visible that is. Not at all? Okay, so let me speak to it. So I think one of the things that's important this year is that the Electoral Act has been amended, and it's been amended to make provision for independent candidates to run for office. What's important about this is that it will change the ballot papers that you receive. So this year, you'll receive 3 ballot papers when you go vote. And basically, the ballot papers will be divided between people that are elected as a result of being members of a political party, and political parties in the National Assembly will get 200 of the 400 seats allocated to them. The other 200 seats are divided up between people that appear on a regional ballot. A region is the same as a province. So they'll appear as independent candidates on a regional ballot alongside political parties. So the other 200 seats are divided up in that manner. And then, of course, you will receive a provincial ballot for the provincial legislature. So in our region, we have 1 regional candidate. You'll see that Gauteng has 2 and Limpopo has 3. I just included that for information. I'm assuming everyone is voting in the Western Cape. So on the regional ballot in the Western Cape, there's only 1 independent candidate. And then very briefly, I thought it might be good to go through the different ballots. So does everyone know what's on each of the ballots? No? Okay, so the first one is for the National Assembly. It's called the National Compensatory Ballot. And that ballot you get, and it's got all of the political parties that are registered nationally and that are running for the National Assembly. So it's much like what you would have received in previous national elections. And so those ballots, all the ballots, you have 1 vote. So you can only pick 1 party. And it only features political parties. I think this year there's over 70 parties registered. Yeah, so actually what you see on the slide, which is not so clear, but when you get the ballot, there's a double column on this ballot. All the others, there's 1 line of options. But on this ballot, there are 2 columns. So the first one will be for the first set of 200 seats in the National Assembly. The second ballot is also for the National Assembly, but it's a regional ballot. So all that means is it's got the independent candidates from your region and also the political parties running for the National Assembly. So even on this ballot, the independent candidates are running for National Assembly. And again, here you pick 1. So the allocation for this ballot is also 200 seats in the legislature. If an independent candidate gets enough votes to occupy 2 seats, they don't get 2 seats. They're 1 person, they get 1 seat. So the rest are divided up according to the proportion of votes. And then the final one is for the provincial ballot. So here also, it's just 1 column, you choose 1. And on this ballot, it's unique to the province. So some provinces will have political parties contesting only in the province. They'll appear on this ballot. So when you go to the voting station, I think maybe this year it will take a little bit longer because 1, the first ballot is so long. Unless you're very clear on who you're voting for when you go in, it might take some time. And then there's three basically sets of votes that you have to cast. So I don't think I need to spend much time on the slide except to say don't WhatsApp anyone from the voting booth. Don't do a TikTok. These are all things people have done and it gets you into trouble because, of course, it's supposed to be a confidential procedure. And then there is a requirement to show your ID when you present yourself at your voting station. So maybe that's something to keep in mind. And it can be either the ID book or your card. Okay, so when I sent Father the presentation, he said, well, actually, this slide is the one that we're interested in. And so I rushed through the others, and I'll take a bit more time with this slide. And I think what I tried to do in preparing for this presentation was to think about some of the big issues that confront us today. So I think one of the threads that runs through the big issues is that South Africa is a place in which the majority of the population at the moment is not doing very well. So it's still a highly unequal society. It's still, unfortunately, counted as the most unequal society worldwide. And I think that shows in many of the issues that are on this slide. So Nisha mentioned health, well, in particular, the NHI bill. That is going to be a big issue, I think, in the upcoming election. It's generated a lot of uncertainty. Some kind of national health system has been in the works since the early 1990s. It was part of the A Better Life for All campaign of the ANC in 1994. And the party has finally pushed through that vision. And yesterday, the NHI Act was enacted. Its intention is to make sure that we can pool resources so that everyone gets access to a better quality of healthcare. There are debates about whether that will happen. Some of these debates link to concerns people have about governance in South Africa. So one set of debates is about if we're saying that we're having a national health insurance fund and it's a large pool of money, how will this fund be administered? And in light of previous experiences with maladministration in the state, what guarantees do we have that the fund will be administered in a way that is really in the interest of the public? Other people say, yes, that's a concern, but can we move towards a health system where we don't have 80% of money that is spent on healthcare being spent in the private sector, which only services 20% of the population, and even the 20% of the population being covered by private health insurance still feels cheated and unable to access a full array of services that they need. So I think healthcare is one area in which parties will compete for votes. Not everyone has endorsed the NHI across the board. And that, I think, is something that sets parties apart. Something that doesn't set parties apart are their promises around unemployment. So most parties promise better jobs, not only better jobs, but more jobs. I think this is important because in South Africa, 60% of the population lives in poverty. The majority of the population depends on social assistance, so grants like the old age grant or the child care assistance grant, now the special relief of distress grant that was introduced during COVID. So most households, more than half households, depend on social grants for their survival. So it's not that you're living comfortably, it's just that you're surviving and meeting some basic needs within the household. And so income generation is a big focus of many of the political parties. In addition to promising jobs, there is now a shift that we've seen where many political parties have moved towards saying, well, maybe we should have something like a basic income grant. So the social relief of distress grant that was introduced during COVID, the 350 Rand grant, seems to now have been accepted as something that might continue. And the new debate And it's many of the big parties speak about this. The new debate is about, well, if you're going to continue a kind of basic income grant for those that don't have other income, and other income would include social assistance from the state. So if you're not receiving another grant, you're not receiving a bursary, and you don't have a job, there is now a shift towards saying, do we move to this kind of more universal subsidy that people can have access to as a means, for example, of being able to get data, to look for a job, or to, if you have an interview, to be able to afford the taxi fare to get to the job, or just to contribute to household access to food. So I think that's another new dimension in our political landscape. The other thing that's new, the selection, it's been mentioned before, but I think the selection, it's much more closely examined and it's much more explicitly incorporated in the party's political platforms is issues of access to energy, and in particular, access to renewable energy. So we all know that we've gone now for how many, 50 days without load shedding? Some people say it will come back on the 30th of May. We'll see. But one of the big issues discussed again by all of the big political parties is how we move from being dependent on coal to feeding more supply from solar and wind energy generation facilities into the grid. It's also a problem of environment. So South Africa is one of the 4 biggest polluting countries in the world, and that is because of the mining industry and our reliance on coal. It also has an impact on health. So in many coal-producing areas in the country, people have huge problems with respiratory diseases. So it also violates the constitutional right to a clean environment. So in many of the election manifestos, there is this commitment towards shifting towards solar and wind. Some manifestos emphasize this as a kind of national government priority and that the government will take steps to bring more big suppliers online in supplying the national grid. Other political parties have taken the approach of thinking about how can households feed the extra energy they generate, for example, from solar panels into the municipal grid. So there are different scales at which this is being explored in different party platforms. The one thing I think also to keep in mind in relation to energy is that it has become more expensive. And so this is something that's especially difficult for poorer households to afford. Okay, so basic infrastructure, water and sanitation. Again, this is something that political parties have been discussing across the board. It is a little bit tricky from the national perspective because quite often the maintenance of infrastructure like sanitation infrastructure, water pipes, this is a municipal function. And so certainly even if you vote for a national party that commits to improving and maintaining infrastructure, there is a kind of link that has to happen between national and municipal. And so I would say on this issue, it's not clear really if the promise is that the infrastructure will be maintained, but there's no clear articulation of how municipalities will be funded more robustly by the national government, that still leaves many issues on the table. And I think it's also connected to issues of energy supply and energy stability. So in my neighborhood, for example, much of last year, the pump station would break down. And the pump station breaks down because the energy supply is interrupted and the pump station isn't built to work on generators, and then that leads to spills of human waste into the rivers and eventually the oceans. So I think there's a kind of siloed approach maybe in many political party platforms to dealing with these issues, but there's also a bigger systemic approach that has to do with governance in an integrated manner. Maybe I will speak very briefly about education. I think one thing to keep in mind in education is that it's one of the areas in which gender inequality shows up quite prominently. So just as a kind of basic indicator. I think during COVID, close to 500,000 children dropped out of school. Many of those children are girl children. So when we look at our youth, one of the challenges in relation to education is thinking about girls, and in particular, the educational opportunities they lose when they become pregnant. I think sometimes it's an issue that's discussed in terms of, bad behavior, but I think there's also a discussion in terms of power imbalances between older men, perhaps targeting younger girls. There is now a policy in place that the national government has implemented that's supposed to ensure that young girls can continue getting access to schooling even when they're pregnant. But one of the things that we have seen in the education sector is that often pregnancy is a barrier for girls in completing matric, and dropout rates are higher amongst girls. Food, hunger, and access to land. South Africa is predominantly a kind of food purchasing society, if I can put it that way. There are huge debates about land redistribution, and a lot of those debates focus on redistributing land in order to assist with commercial farming. So the vision isn't one of small-scale farming. And I mention this because one of the things it means is that in future, access to food is likely to be mediated through access to money and access to supermarkets. And one of the things that we saw during COVID, and that's continued, is that many households go hungry routinely. Again, the burden of hunger falls disproportionately to women. And if we think about this from a kind of public health perspective, what it means for many South African children is that there are multiple generations of children growing up hungry and therefore stunted. And this impacts their long-term health. So again, I think this is one of the big issues. It's discussed, I think, quite often very abstractly at this high level about access to land for farming. But at the level of households and making food more accessible, I would say this is one of the things to look at. So I'm being told to wrap up in terms of manifestos. The final thing that I'll focus on is xenophobia. I've called it xenophobia in many political party platforms. It's framed as immigration. For me, this is a little bit dishonest because a lot of the rhetoric actually is about stigmatizing non-citizens, whether they're here documented or not. And so I think for me, again, this is one of the things that's very new in South African political discourse, the things that are permissible to say about people that either are non-citizens or who are perceived to be non-citizens. And for me, that's one of the more unsettling aspects of political party platforms that increasingly, if you listen to the radio, for example, someone will be asked, what's your party's platform on foreigners? And so I think that's a kind of shift, and a quite alarming shift that's entered into South African political discourse, and then is now articulated in a very formal way in political party platforms. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Lauren. That was really enlightening, and I definitely learned some new things. Really fantastic. I rushed Lauren a bit at the end there just so that we could give the audience a chance to engage as well. So we'd like to open up for questions, and I think we'll take 3 questions at a time, and then Lauren will give a response. And could I just ask you to please just briefly introduce yourself, say who you are before you ask your question, and try to keep the question fairly concise. And if someone could just assist me with passing the mic around to those who have questions.
Thank you. Ian Barker. Do you think we are mature enough to handle coalition politics, looking at what's been going on up to now?
Hi, Andrew Whitelaw. Thanks very much. I think I've got a much easier question than that one. I mean, you've listed a lot of the issues there. I mean, and I'm just curious where you see things like safety and security and corruption and possibly even foreign affairs fitting into kind of the political landscape at the moment. Thanks.
Just on the regional votes, is that based in terms of the seating? Is it just based on vote numbers, or have each region been allocated a certain number of seats?
I think so. So I'll start maybe from that. As far as I understand it, and I'm new to the system too, the regions compete for the 200 seats. So it's not like within those 200 seats, there's a proportion allocated to a specific region. So as I understand it, it's an open competition for the 200 seats. The provincial legislatures each have a different number of seats, and that's determined by the IEC, except for the Western Cape. The Western Cape provincial government determines the number of seats in the Western Cape province. I don't know why that is, but that's what the IEC says it is. So in terms of coalition politics, I'm not sure. If you know, when you're trained as a political scientist, you're trained to look at the data, and the data is unsettling. Certainly at municipal level, coalition politics seems not to result in stable coalitions. They don't tend to form long-term partnerships, and they seem also to function as a way of co-opting members of smaller parties and maybe extending patronage through those mechanisms of co-opting leaders of parties. So I'm not sure. As I say, at the municipal level, the data is discouraging. I think at a national level, it will depend. It might be that at a national level, the coalition has fewer partners, depending on the proportion of votes that the biggest party wins. That might make the coalition easier to manage. But, you know, to me, it's not something I feel confident predicting what will happen, because it's so uncharted, it's something so new. That's probably not a very satisfying answer, but that's as far as I'm willing to go. Then in terms of safety and security, foreign policy, and corruption. So I think corruption or maladministration is a huge issue. I will say that in terms of the judiciary and oversight, access to information, promoting transparency, that the legislature perhaps isn't doing a great job, but the judiciary seems to, the courts seem to be doing a good job, at least in terms of exposing information. There seems to be, I think, a measure of accountability when matters are brought to court. I think one of the challenges historically has been bringing cases to court, so the MPA has struggled with that in relation to corruption. But I think if we look at the three branches of government, in my view at least, the judiciary is still well respected and also trusted. That said, there is a problem, and I don't think it's necessarily, I think it's systemic, and so I don't think it's necessarily a problem of voting out a particular leader and getting rid of the problem. Safety and security is an issue. I think, again, here I would say, of course, it affects everyone, but it affects, I think, people in poorer communities disproportionately. And also, I didn't mention gender-based violence, femicide, and so on, rape, sexual violence, but these remain huge problems. And increasingly, there's anecdotal reports about children being victims of trafficking. So I think those matters are of huge concern. And it's not clear to me that much is being done in political party platforms to address gender-based violence in particular, if I'm thinking of that. And then the other thing, safety and security, foreign policy, I think is a hot topic. I think it's probably, if we're thinking about coalitions, one of the policy areas that will make coalitions difficult and perhaps impossible between some parties. I think it's one of the more divisive issues in South Africa and globally, actually, at the moment.
I just want to say a very big thank you to Lauren for that really fantastic presentation. And thank you to all those who asked questions as well. Our next speaker is going to give us the view from Catholic social teaching and reflect on the South African 2024 elections with that perspective. So our speaker is Mike Pothier, who is the program manager of the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office. This is an office of the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference. He has been involved in parliamentary advocacy since 1997 and has helped train public policy activists from 30 African countries. And apart from his CPLO work, Mike is a practicing advocate of the High Court. Thank you for joining us here today, Mike, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and good evening. My third appearance at St. Michael's in the last 5 weeks, I think, or something. You're not sick of me yet, it's amazing. Before I get into the sort of Catholic social teaching side of things, if I could just piggyback on a couple of points that Lauren made, and maybe just add one or two perspectives there. And I hate to do this to a political scientist, but a small correction to start with. Arising from one of your questions, each region does have an allocation of seats out of the 200. Western Cape gets 23 of those seats. Gauteng is the biggest, gets 48 of those seats. So the parties and the independent candidates competing on the regional ballot are competing in each province or region for a certain number of those 200 seats. Now that has a very important consequence, which is also to be borne in mind, and I'm conscious that I don't want to make things more complicated than they need to be. In previous elections, we have just got two ballots, one for the provincial parliament, one for the national parliament. You made your 2 marks, you went home, and that was it. But behind the scenes, the IEC counted that national paper twice. The first count they did at regional level to find out how did the parties do in this region and how many of the 23 Western Cape seats are the parties going to get in the National Assembly. And they did that for all the parties in all the regions stroke provinces. And they allocated the 200 seats that way. But that threw up little anomalies because of percentage fractions. You know, if someone wins 50% of 23 seats, well, they get 12.5 seats. What do you do with that half? Now, you multiply that out by all the parties and all the provinces, you've got all these leftover bits and pieces. And we have to achieve perfect proportionality. So a party that gets 75% of the votes across the country must have 300 of the 400 seats in parliament. Otherwise, we're moving away from proportionality. And so with an incredibly complicated statistical thing, which involved allocations, first, second, third allocations, they would compensate from the second count of all the national ballot papers for those anomalies. And that's why you would find, for example, in the present parliament, a party like Al-Jamaa, which won, I think, 32,000 votes nationally, has a seat in parliament, even though you needed 46,000 votes in our last election to earn 1 seat. And so it goes. This time around, they're not going to count the paper twice because we've split it into a national and a regional, and each of them will only be counted once. But the same proportional result has to be achieved. And why is this important? Because, and I'm possibly the only person who's worried about this, if you vote for Party A on your regional paper, and then you vote for Party B on your national paper, you are effectively cancelling out your vote. Because when you vote for the Party A on the regional paper, you are boosting it for a seat or seats in the National Assembly. If you then switch to another party on your national paper, you're boosting it for a compensation out of the same pool of 400 seats in the National Assembly. Remember, it's split 200 and 200, but it's the same assembly. Okay? So in other words, it makes no sense to vote for different parties on your regional and your national paper. By all means, vote for an independent candidate regionally, because as soon as that person gets the required number of votes to earn a seat, they get a seat. They're not affected by the compensation because they're not proportional. They're only standing in this one place. They're not standing all around the country and earning proportional votes all around the country. Excess votes that independent candidates receive, as Lauren said, they can't get 2 seats. They can't give their votes to anyone else. They will go back into the pool at the national level and be allocated out amongst the parties proportionately. If you want to split your vote between the provincial parliament and the national parliament, by all means. Because now you're voting for 2 different parties, or an independent and a party, in different forums. So you're not cancelling anything out. I hope that's relatively clear. And the IEC person I consulted said, yes, it is a cancellation, but we can't say that because the IEC would then be accused of directing people how to vote, and that's the most sacred thing that they would never do. Okay. The other thing is the topics that Lauren has mentioned there, if you want to dig a little bit deeper into a church perspective on those things, if you go to our website, and if you just type in CPLO for Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, we'll come up first on Google. And under the Publications tab, you'll find 5 briefing papers. By tomorrow, you'll find 5. I think at the moment, you'll find 3. That deal with refugees and migrants, environment and climate change, socioeconomic policy, job creation, and similar things, and women, children, vulnerable sectors of the population, gender-based violence, drug policy, all that stuff. That's 4 topics, 5 papers, because our director writes very long papers on refugees and migrants, and I had to cut them into 2. But and they're quite detailed. They look at the policies of just about every serious party on those topics. So if you want to go into that, that's a resource that's available for you. Okay. I'm going to start with Vatican II. It's always the best place to start with these things. I mean, obviously, those of you who've come out tonight are planning to vote. I mean, I'm assuming that no one is sitting here trying to justify their decision that they're not going to bother to vote. But you might know people who are wavering or who don't think it's worth it, or worse than that, who think that somehow, and there are many such people, that Christians, Catholics, must stay out of politics and it's some sort of dirty business that we shouldn't be involved in. So the basis of the Church's social teaching about politics and elections in particular, one of the bases we can find in paragraph 75 of the great document Gaudium et Spes that came out of Second Vatican Council in 1965, and it's worth reading just because of the language, even if you don't necessarily accept what the bishops were saying. And this is real bishop language. It is in full conformity with human nature that there should be juridico-political structures, providing all citizens in an ever better fashion and without any discrimination, with the practical possibility of freely and actively taking part in the establishment of the juridical foundations of the political community and in the direction of public affairs, in fixing the terms of reference of the various public bodies, and in the election of political leaders. In other words, there should be political structures, and they should be open to us to take part in them. All citizens, therefore, should be mindful of the right and also the duty to use their free vote to further the common good. The Church praises and esteems the work of those who, for the good of, it says men, people, devote themselves to the service of the state and take on the burdens of this office. Now, I think it's pretty crystal clear, if you followed that at all, that the Church says, vote. Don't stay at home. Take an interest, get out there, examine the options, and vote. There really is no excuse for, shall we say, a sort of conforming Catholic not to do it? Who do you vote for? How do you decide how to vote? There's so many different ways of approaching that. I'm going to share with you just a few of the principles of Catholic social teaching that bear on this in particular. There, as many of you will know, it's not a closed list, the principles of Catholic social teaching. There are quite a number of them, and people have different sort of lists. I'm quoting here from a Jesuit priest, Father William Byron, who wrote this many years ago. It's always a good idea in this place to quote from Jesuits, and they invite you back. I would never dare to quote from a Dominican in this hall. These are based on a pastoral letter of the American bishops issued in about 1998 or so. Firstly, the principle of human dignity. Every human being is created in the image of God and therefore is invaluable and worthy of respect as a member of the human family. This is the bedrock principle of Catholic social teaching. And they go on to say very interestingly, individuals have dignity. Individualism has no place in Catholic social thought. The principle of human dignity gives the human person a claim on membership in a community, in the human family. And politics, if you think about it, the polis is the community, the family, even though we kind of hate each other within that family. So our dignity leads us to our sense of community, to our belonging in a community, and to valuing the dignity equally of everybody else. And it should be fairly obvious to see from that about working together, about building community. We're not just individuals to look after our own personal, narrow interests. Then there's the principle of association. The person is not only sacred, but also social. How we organize our society in economics and politics, in law and policy, directly affects human dignity and the capacity of individuals to grow in community. Clearly, again, I think you can see the obvious application to the world of politics and parties and elections and so on. And flowing very closely from that, the principle of participation. We believe, say the American bishops, people have a right and a duty. And notice that the right and the duty are always the two sides of the same coin. To participate in society, seeking together the common good and the well-being of all, especially the poor and the vulnerable. Think immediately of our political parties. Which of them genuinely, really is concerned, firstly for the common good of the whole population of our country, but especially for the poor and the vulnerable? They all say it. Which of them really are? And then the principle of solidarity. Simply put, we are our brothers and sisters' keepers. Pope John Paul II put it in really strong language. Solidarity is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. When you vote, you've got to be thinking of the effect of your vote on everybody else, particularly, again, the most vulnerable, the most needy, the most helpless, those who can't vote because they're too young to vote. That large percentage of our population who do not vote. In the last municipal elections, 1/3 of our adult population voted. Only 2/3 of our adult population is registered to vote. 1/3 of them is not registered at all. And we can argue why that is, but when you vote, you've got to be thinking of them also, because they're not expressing their voice for whatever reason. And then the last of these values that I want to mention in connection with voting is the principle of the common good, which I think we probably all more or less understand. The sum total of social conditions that allow people to reach their full human potential and to realize, coming full circle, their human dignity. Which of our parties is promoting the common good of the nation as a whole? And which of them are perhaps more sectoral or pushing the interests of a narrow group, perhaps being divisive rather than unifying, not building. You've got to identify that for yourselves, but those would be some of the sort of entry points for your analysis. And then, still under the heading of social teaching, our own bishops have you shared this in the parish yet, if I may ask? Yeah. So back in February, they published this pastoral letter for the national and provincial elections. And I found it very interesting because I think this is pretty much the strongest such letter that our bishops have published. They've done one, I think, for every election since 1994. And there's always been a bit of a debate about how far they can go in directing, pushing, persuading people how to vote. In other words, who to vote for. And there's pretty much a sacrosanct principle that the church will never tell you, you must vote for that party or you may not vote for such and such a party. They've done it in Italy when it looked like the communists may take over, but that's just an exception. They generally won't do that. But listen to what the bishops say in this letter. And it, again, easily available on websites, the Archdiocese of Cape Town website, the SACBC website. It's worth reading. They start on a very positive note, and I think this is important, to say we must give thanks that we've maintained our democratic right to go to the polls and to freely choose our leaders. We acknowledge the sterling work of the Independent Electoral Commission. If I can say, as a sort of side thing, that's very true. We should be proud of the IEC. It's one of the best public bodies in this country. You might say that's not saying much, maybe. But by world standards, it's a top-notch electoral body. There are very few, if any, that are better than it. And you can have absolute confidence in our IEC and in the credibility of the results that they deliver. So they acknowledge that to start with. Then they go into the prophet Haggai, who some of us had never heard of, and they talk about how Haggai spoke to the people during their years of trying to rebuild the nation after the magnificent dream that the Jewish people had had of their return from exile. They had found it hard and challenging work and had given way to despair. Does this sound a bit familiar? Here we are 30 years on from our great return to democracy and all the rest of it, and how many of us are losing hope and losing spirit and despairing, etc. And the bishops say, well, we experience the ever-growing gap between those who have and have not. We experience deteriorating infrastructure, rampant corruption on the part of self-serving citizens, and violence. But we do not allow ourselves to be robbed of the hope that together we can keep to our vision of a country which is home to all. So they're being fairly upbeat at the beginning of the letter. And then come a couple of, to me, interesting and powerful points. They say, mindful of the sacrifices that so many made during the struggle against apartheid, we are disgusted by what we have seen and experienced, seeing how many of our leaders feed themselves, betraying the legitimate dreams of our people. We have seen the parable of the rich man and Lazarus become a reality before our eyes. I've worked with the bishops for a very long time, and I've never read that kind of sentiment from them, so plainly put, disgusted. And that tells us something. And then they say, I'm skipping out bits, the election and its results will determine whether the country will be placed on a different path from the current path of corruption and incompetence. Now again, for me, this is unprecedented. The bishops are saying our present government is characterized by corruption and incompetence. And although they don't say we must choose another path, they say it about as clearly as they could, determine whether the country will be placed on a different path. I think it's fair to say that that is a call for change in not just governance, but government. Although, don't quote me. We strongly appeal to all eligible voters to go out and vote and send a message to incoming parliamentarians. Nobody should remain at home. Send a message. And the message again is an end to incompetence and corruption and all the other ills that we are so familiar with. For the good of the country, vote according to your experience and your conscience, not according to unquestioning loyalty to one political party or another. Consider what is important for the whole nation, not just what is good for you personally or for your political party and its alliance partners. There's only one political party in this country that has alliance partners. So again, they are being as direct as they possibly could be. I suspect that they didn't even realize how direct they were being when they wrote that last sentence. I have a couple of minutes. Am I finished? Okay. Another useful resource from the Jesuit Institute and the Justice and Peace Commission of the Bishops' Conference is this little pamphlet, of which I've bought some copies. I think there may also be others in the parish. And this, again, is just quite helpful. It gives you some of the stuff that we've covered here this evening about the mechanics of the election and so on, and a whole bunch of questions that can be asked, like manifesto points. What do the parties say about blah, 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 blah. So that's worth looking at. Last 2 points I want to mention, not strictly under a Catholic social teaching heading, but I think they are important, is beware of the notion of single issue voting, which is a temptation. Focusing on that one thing which is really important to you and ignoring all the other questions. That just does not work in our kind of a democracy. We do have some parties which have narrow focuses, but you will almost inevitably find that if Party A really resonates with you on whatever, its policy on abortion, or the death penalty, or the basic income grant, or climate change, or something, you're going to find other aspects of its policies that don't really resonate with you at all. You've got to take the parties as a whole, not just reduce any one of them to what it says about a particular single issue. And lastly, the question of strategic voting. I have a friend who used to vote for the ANC in the early days, got very disillusioned the last 3 or 4 elections, is voted for anyone but the ANC, and now he's planning to vote for them again. Not because he's any less disillusioned with them, but because he's more scared of an ANC that gets 40% and has to get into bed with the EFF than he is of an ANC that gets 50%. That's strategic voting. He might have to hold his nose, but it's sensible. It's rational. Okay? We have way too many people in our country who can't possibly think of voting for a particular party. That's a wrong approach to politics. All of this that I've tried to cover here is saying use your brain, discern. Don't feel yourself wedded to a particular ideology or party or leader. Think carefully about it. And lastly, of course, pray about it. At the end of the bishop's letter, there's a long prayer for elections. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. That was really empowering. And I really think it really helped us to make some informed decisions and was very enlightening. So thank you so much for that. We're going to open up for some questions. And again, we'll take 3 first and then see if we've got time for a few more. Do we have any questions? Or maybe I'll start off just to get things moving. Mike, I'm just keen to understand, I think what a lot of people face is the struggle between the ideological principles that underpin a party and then the more practical sort of evidence of effective and efficient governance. And how must one think about that when making a decision?
We have a problem in this country when it comes to that question because we've been governed nationally, obviously, by one party since 1994, and it's also governed almost all the time in almost all the provinces. In other words, there's one track record to look at and assess, apart from obviously here in the Western Cape, where we've had a different party governing the province since 2009. KZN was governed by an ANC IFP coalition for the first 10 or 15 years as well. So you've got to look at track records. You've got to look at the evidence of what parties have managed to do. And as I said, we've got a skewed situation here. No one actually knows how the EFF would govern the province or the country, or for that matter, how Cope or Rise Mzansi would do. So then you've got to look at policy consistency, if they haven't been in government. So if you can't look at how they've implemented their policies and their ideologies, you've got to look at how consistent they've been in promoting and expressing those policies, or do they flip-flop a lot of the time? Are they internally contradictory in the sorts of things that they say? You've got to be aware of populism, which I think it's a huge growing problem all over the world. Europe, states, everywhere, but here as well. Parties and leaders that simply make promises, which you know they will never, ever be able to keep. They have no intention of trying to keep them, but they think they can buy votes. That's quite a common problem with many of our parties. So those are some of the ways in which you're just going to use your critical thinking faculties, not have the wool pulled over your eyes, and be quite skeptical about claims.
Great. Thanks. Mike, are there any questions from the audience? Sounds like you were crystal clear. Oh, there we go.
Thanks. I'm going to come back to the theme of coalitions that you brought up earlier. So most of the polls are predicting the ANC is going to be sitting at 40 to 45%. I mean, and the polls may or may not bring, but hypothetically, if the ANC gets in that region, which of the parties do you think they would be most comfortable getting into coalition with, and vice versa, which parties would be willing to get into coalition with the ANC? And I mean, it's a bit of a loaded question, and I'm not sure if you're prepared to start sticking your neck out.
Okay.
Thank you. Not really. I just want to know, are you suggesting that Vatican II is saying that it's a sin not to vote?
Yeah, I'll start with that one. I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, if it depends why you're not voting. Of course, there are people who have sat and thought long and hard about it and have decided for what are to them good reasons that it's not something that they want to do. Obviously, that's the case, and you don't have to vote by law in this country. You do in others. But I would suggest that such a conscience has probably not been correctly formed, if that's what your conscience has driven you to. And if it's just a question of laziness and it's a public holiday and bugger that, that's a long queue, I'm going to the beach, then yeah, that's sinful to me. Yeah. Because you're dropping your community. You're giving up a right, which is maybe your right to do, but you're giving up a duty as well, which is a problem. Coalitions, I don't think anyone knows, and least of all the political parties at the moment. So, what most of the commentators are saying is that the closer the ANC gets to 50, the easier it will be for them to link up with a few small parties and grab those extra 5 or 10 seats that they need to get the 200 plus 1 to govern. Whereas if they get closer to 40, then they've got to look at bigger parties. I mean, it's fairly simple arithmetic. I don't know. My belief is that most political parties have been quite silly and immature in expressing their determination not to go into coalitions without knowing where they stand afterwards. And that links up to what we were saying earlier about loyalties, this sort of precious notion that I couldn't possibly vote for so-and-so or so-and-so, and I couldn't possibly go into coalition with that lot. There's always someone worse. There's always a worse option. So I don't know. There's also the interesting possibility of minority governance where you could have an arrangement. Let's say the ANC gets 45% and chooses or can't find coalition partners. It can still govern. It'll still be by far the biggest party with support on particular issues from a different range of parties. That happens in quite a number of countries. It's not very stable and can be tricky, and we have no experience of it. But it could certainly happen.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think let's give a warm round of applause to Lauren and Mike. It's really been two fantastic presentations, and I really feel, honestly, that we need to take Lauren and Mike on a roadshow, because I do feel more people need to hear about these issues that we've talked about today. And perhaps that's a challenge to everyone who's here. In addition to casting your vote on the 29th of May, spread the word, encourage others as well, and have conversations, use the opportunity to advocate and educate around the importance of voting on the 29th of May. That brings us to the end of this evening's session. I just want to say a very big thank you to everyone involved in organizing today. I don't want to mention names because I will miss somebody and feel awful tonight. But a very big thank you to the organizers, the people who've helped with the tech audiovisual support, the people who've helped with the refreshments in advertising this event, and to all of you for taking the time and effort to come, be active citizens and be engaged citizens. Very big thank you, and have a good evening.